Government Gay, Alex Reynolds series, Book 1. Writer, Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1997. Narrator, Eric Arst. Dedicated for Joan Edwards, who told me so. Chapter 17. There's a lot I don't understand, said Peter, with only the barest twinge of petulance. He didn't like not being in the know, especially when his privates had been exposed to a Russian. It was late that evening. The five of us sat around our living room holding a post-mortem on the affair. Agent Nelson, who had informed us that his first name was Lawrence, was seated on the couch with Mother in an arrangement that Frank, who sat nearby on a straight-back chair, was none too happy with. Nelson held a scotch on the rocks in one hand, and Mother was holding her usual civilized cup of tea. Peter and I were sitting near each other on chairs facing the couch, and each of us had a snifter of brandy, our fingers interlaced from time to time, which did not escape the notice of Nelson. Frank wasn't drinking. James Martin's dive from the top of Sears Tower had made a big splash on the evening news. However, the media only identified him as an unidentified man. I shuddered to think of how they identified what remained of him as a man. Agent Nelson had shared with Frank the identity of the body, but Frank didn't relay it to anyone else. I knew that the general public would never know. Frank and his fellow officers had dutifully gone to the seal pool at the local Lincoln Park Zoo and picked up Volkov, who was now in custody but was not inclined to talk about anything. He had, according to Frank, reverted to a highly imperfect understanding of the English language, responding to the question with a blank stare, signifying that he was but a poor foreigner who didn't understand what was happening to him. Frank was not happy that we'd deceived him for so long, and that Nelson had also deceived him, since it turned out that Nelson had not been very communicative about our involvement in the CIA business. But he was very happy to be part of the denouement. "What don't you understand?" said Nelson. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, leaning forward, "what started this whole thing to begin with?" "Oh," Mother answered this one. I chimed in. "I did," she said. "Yes, actually something you said made it really clear to me. You remember when we found that article in the paper about Matthew Corbin's kidnapping? You said something like, if they're kidnapping people for money and getting away with it, they'd be doing it all right in Russia. You'd think America is the last place they'd want to be, remember?" "Yes." "Well, that's when it hit me. What if one of them wanted to be in America?" Nelson smiled. "You really did get it then." Mother looked from him to me. "What? I don't understand." "Correct me if I'm wrong," I said to Nelson, then turned to Mother. "But even though they were getting away with a lot of money in Russia, there's a difference between the good life in Russia and the good life in America." Nelson was nodding his head. I continued, "I suspect that Victor Haychek wanted to come to America and was willing to sell out his buddies to get there." "Is that true?" said Mother to Nelson. Frank shifted in his seat. "Your son's hit the nail on the head. Victor Haychek contacted us and told us he would return over information about a kidnapping ring in Russia, an organized group grabbing Americans and holding them for ransom, if we would give him asylum in America. Kidnapping is a growth industry in Russia. You know, he was to turn the information over to us on his arrival here." "Wait a minute," said Frank, and I got the sense that he was anxious to split some hairs here. "The CIA has an office in Russia, doesn't it?" "Mm-hmm." "Then why did you let Haychek come here? Why didn't you make him turn it into them there before you'd give him transport?" "That was where he had us. Like most criminals, he didn't trust anyone, let alone us. He didn't trust us to carry through with our promise of sanctuary. He insisted on dealing with our Washington headquarters directly. He said he wouldn't turn it over to us until he was on American soil." "Sounds pretty smart." "Not really," Nelson replied with a hint of disdain in his voice. "After all, we could always have sent him right back if he couldn't deliver. I'm afraid that he wasn't really very bright, but like a lot of people of his sort, he was crafty." "And what exactly was it?" Mother asked. "I've never seen anything like that little tube." "We provided him with the necessary equipment to take special photographs of abductions and transactions. That was the proof we wanted. That's what he was carrying, film." "How did James Martin fit into all of this?" asked Peter. Nelson looked at me and smiled again and said, "Do you want to try that one?" I smiled back and said, "Well, something came to me in a flash when he conked you on the head, and I realized he was the culprit." "You stop talking like a B-movie," said Peter with a laugh. Sorry. I mean, when I realized he was involved, I looked at Nelson. Did it have something to do with background checks? Background checks, said Mother, her forehead wrinkling over her amused eyes. He's right again, Mrs. Reynolds. We don't know yet how the Russian end of this ring first got hold of Martin, and we may never know, since both Martin and Haycheck are dead, and we can't expect the ones who are still alive to do much talking. I suspect that it was through someone in our Russian office, though. I hate to admit it, that would also help explain why Haycheck was so insistent on not dealing with our Russian office. Hopefully the film he took will shed some light on that. Anyway, part of Martin's job was doing background checks on potential CIA recruits, which gave him fairly unlimited access through us to a lot of personal information on a lot of people, including Americans working in Russia, including information on their assets and the assets of their companies. Oh, good Lord, said Mother, setting down her tea. So he would come up with the most likely candidates for kidnapping, and they would snatch them and then give Martin a cut of whatever ransom they got? Uh-huh, said Nelson. Like I said, we don't have all the links yet, but now that we know Martin was involved, we should be able to find the proof. After all, he had to be doing something with that money. And his friends, other members of the kidnapping ring, followed Haycheck, said Peter. Yes, said Nelson, his tone a bit more disdainful, and that's an example of why I think Haycheck wasn't any too smart. For one thing, his friends must have somehow caught on to the fact that Haycheck was about to duck out, and they contacted Martin, then followed Haycheck here. How do you know that? For the simple reason that once Haycheck contacted us, we started keeping a very watchful eye on him and monitoring his correspondence. He was a little hesitant when he said that last bit, as if he was embarrassed to admit that the CIA was reading someone's mail, as if that's the worst thing they could ever be accused of. And, I prodded, and 2 days before he was to leave for Washington, he received a letter and a ticket to Chicago on Aeroflot. On what? Said Frank. A Russian International Airlines flight that comes direct from Russia to O'Hare. The letter said it was too dangerous for him to come to Washington, so we would meet him in Chicago. Why didn't you just tell him it was a fake? Said Peter. I shook my head. I think I can answer that one, too. They wanted to trap the American contact in the kidnapping ring here. Isn't that right? Exactly. We knew one of our people was involved, but didn't know who. This was a way to confirm it. That's why instead of stopping Haycheck from coming here, I came too. That isn't the story you told us when you first came to us, I said. Nelson shrugged. I told you what was most expedient. I wasn't sure I liked his answer. Forever willing to give the benefit of the doubt, Mother said, Isn't it possible that Haycheck just had an attack of conscience about being part of a kidnapping ring and wanted to put an end to it? Oh, please, Mother, I said, rolling my eyes. What? Well, in the first place, he could have done that without leaving Russia. And in the second place, he thought nothing of endangering my life when he realized he was in trouble. I'm afraid that's true, said Nelson, nodding in agreement. You could never accuse Victor Haycheck of altruism. I have another question. What about the shooting of Foreman? Said Peter. The other night under the overpass. Who shot him? Nelson smiled at me, and I returned the favor. You did, didn't you? I said more as a statement than a question. How'd you figure that out? He actually looked surprised, because while we were hanging there on the tower, Martin denied having done it. He sneered when he said it, but I believed him anyway. It's just as I thought. You knew the whole thing was a setup when I called you. You decided that it would be a good time to get the goods on one or more members of this gang, so you went there and waited. Martin sent Foreman to flush you out and kill both you and me. That's why he insisted I go there, even though I didn't really need to, and you shot Foreman when he was about to kill me. I plead guilty, said Nelson, his smile growing rather self-satisfied. I guess you saved my life. I suppose I should be grateful. Aren't you? Why did you fire the second shot? The one that just missed me? For the first time in our acquaintance, Nelson laughed. To get you out of there. You're possibly the only person I know who'd hang around somewhere that shots are being fired. I nodded ruefully. I wasn't about to admit to him that I'd been afraid to move. We all just sort of grinned stupidly at one another and acted as if it were a lark. That this man had shot at me and endangered my life by using me to get to the other people. I sighed and said, There's 2 things you can clear up for me, if you will. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons we suspected you was because you were seen talking to Volkov at the bar, and we thought you knew him. What were you doing? As you may have noticed from Victor Haychek, there is no honor among thieves. When Volkov was left alone at the bar, I simply took the opportunity to approach him about the possibility of turning informant for an unspecified price. I see, I nodded thoughtfully. That only leaves one thing that I really don't understand. What's that? Why in the hell did you call yourself James Martin when you came here? Why didn't you just tell us your real name, or if anything, use a different name from one of the suspects? Nelson's beautiful olive skin actually reddened. That is the one area where you proved too clever for me. How? Said Mother, her face beaming. I used Martin's name on the outside possibility that you would call the office here to find out if we really had an agent by that name. It never even occurred to me that you'd go down to his office and confront him. I'll probably be demoted for that one. We talked a little while longer. Then Agent Nelson said it was time for him to leave. He'd be going back to Washington as soon as possible. Frank looked elated at that news. Mother clucked her tongue and said, That's a shame. We'd like to have you for dinner. Frank did not look elated at that one. As for me, I couldn't help feeling a tinge of melancholy at this news. Like I said before, I'm not a thrill seeker, but the past few days had certainly been a change of pace. Peter and I, our arms around each other's waists, saw Nelson to the door. Mother went with us, and Frank sort of lingered behind in the living room as if he was disinclined to leave until he was sure Nelson was gone. At the door, Nelson turned to me and said, You know, I realize the three of you have been tossed around in the middle of this business, but I think you were pretty damn clever to put as much of this together as you did, with the little information you had, and you certainly showed a lot of bravery, especially you, Alex. I could feel my face turning red. I shuffled a little and said, Thank you. You know, we might be able to find occasionally a use for someone of your ilk. Maybe we could call on you from time to time if there's a need. I winced a little at his use of the word ilk, because I had a feeling that he didn't mean it in the nicest way, but I couldn't stop my heart from racing at the thought of the newfound career. We'd be glad to help, I said happily. Just think of us as your little government gays. Are you out of your bloody mind, said Mother, folding her arms across her chest. After all the danger they put us in, you would even think of working with them. I just smiled. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.